Today we're talking to Dr. Klint Kendrick.
So I've been in and around the M&A space for really my whole career, Brandon. I was acquired a couple of times early on in my career. And one of those times, I'm that guy that walked away with $1 million book of business. I was working in talent acquisition staffing at the time. And the way the acquisition was handled in that particular case, I was being faced with a pay cut and a change to my pay mix that was so significant that I wasn't going to be able to cover my rent on the base and the pay periods that were given to us. So I chose to move on at the time. I was fortunate to be in that position. And that sort of followed me through my career. It wasn't for another 15 years or so that I started to get knee deep in the M&A work like I am now. But I really carried that with me, that anytime we do an M&A event, if there are people involved, it's going to affect employees, it's going to affect families, it's going to affect communities, it's going to affect potentially retirees from the organization. So, most M&A, not all, will affect people. And I've really had a passion for, just like you, for people enjoying, if they can, the work that they do.
So Clint, you have earned a PhD, you have written the HR Practitioner's Guide to M&A, you have founded the roundtables. What drove you to pursue a PhD and start these things that serve so many people?
Sure. But, I was raised in a military household, and service has always been part of that. Joining the military was not right for me for a career choice. But that spirit of service is something that's just lived with me through my family, through the people that I choose to hang around with. As far as writing the book goes, it's something that once I finished a dissertation, and my dissertation topic was on employee engagement and leadership. Not surprisingly, there's a connection. Leaders drive the level of engagement of their employees, and we were able to demonstrate that empirically. And I think that has a lot of connections with what we do in the merger and acquisition world, where we really rely on leaders to guide teams through this change process. And it's not a lot different than any other type of major organizational change as far as the things that need to get done for the employee experience, which then feeds the company's productivity and profitability. So, long story short, you take care of the employees and they'll take care of you. That's one of the fundamental concepts behind engagement. And if you take care of acquired employees, they will take care of the company as well. And if they're not a good fit, giving them a graceful, honorable exit and soft landing for their next opportunity, in my mind, helps the rest of the team stay on board and become productive and help that company drive profitability. So, not a lot of people in HR work full-time jobs doing M&A. It's a very niche job. What I find, Brandon, is that there's a lot more people where they do a little bit of M&A, and often it becomes their side job, right? So they're putting in 40, 50, 60 hours a week as an HR leader at an organization. And then all of a sudden somebody walks up to them and says, hey, we're about to go buy this company, or hey, we're about to go sell this division and we need HR help. And having watched HR people where this is not their full-time job really struggle with the fact that it's a brand new context for them to apply their skills. And it's really an area that feels intimidating to a lot of people. It's kind of scary. You're throwing around a lot bigger numbers than most HR people deal with when you talk about purchase prices and some of the business implications of it. The single biggest determiner of the success or failure of your deal is going to be the people.
Excellent. Yeah, I've had the chance. You shared with me a little bit of your writing on employee engagement. We have some common interests there, and it's very evident that you have a strong, deep understanding of the service profit chain, how leadership creates an environment which produces outcomes for an organization. And you frequently talk about culture, leadership, organization as the areas that we're being stewards of. If you contrast that with the transactional nature that maybe other professionals in valuation or and other aspects of the deal, they're very focused on things that are about the deal. You strike me as somebody that's much more value focused, and being that you've done more than 80 deals, is this important for somebody to be an HR M&A professional? Is this an important distinction, to be a value focused person rather than transaction focused person?
I think you have to wear both hats. So, I kind of look at it when I went to go buy my last house. I had to understand how much house I could afford, what I wanted in the house, how that house was going to help me live my life in a way that added value. And I'll circle back to that in a moment. And so, in a lot of ways, working with that corporate development team in most organizations is a lot like working with a real estate agent, right? They're going to go out, they're going to find the house, they're going to help make sure that it gets closed, that the title transfer takes place, like all of those things that I have to do to be sitting in my home right now and call it mine. That's the front end of the process. Um, what's really fascinating, Brandon, is I've owned this place for about 4 years since I moved here to Milwaukee. And my real estate agent has not called me up once to ask me how much I enjoy living in this neighborhood. He hasn't called me up once to ask me how much I like the paint color inside the house, and of course, why would he, right? That's not his job. His job was to get me to close. And then I think he sent me a nice bottle of wine or something about 30 days after because he wanted me to refer my friends.
Yeah.
But that's the limited service that my real estate agent offers. For me to get value out of living in my home, just like for a company to get value out of their acquisition, you have to start doing different things. So for me in my home, I painted the walls. I put in new light fixtures. I looked at the way I wanted my furniture arranged. And to me, that has a much bigger impact on my quality of life in this home than signing a stack of papers with a notary when I went to close. And that's a different skill set. That's where the value skill set really comes in. And I do firmly believe that the value in M&A transactions in most cases is driven by the people. You're relying on the people to go execute whatever strategy there is. A lot of times in M&A, for people who aren't familiar, you're overpaying for the company that you're buying. You have to induce the seller to want to sell to you. And usually that means that you're buying at a premium. Well, to make up that gap, we use synergies to go in and figure out how much more money we're going to make or how much more money we're going to save. And a lot of times that's what drives some of the value in the deal. And HR is a big part of that. You need somebody to actually execute those plans that eventually make financial sense to the firm doing the acquisition. So in my mind, you have to be able to handle both the transaction and the value add piece in order to be successful in this kind of role.
When you think about, all of the HR M&A leaders that and probably most of them, what really do you think makes a great HR M&A leader?
Well, I think it's a combination of humility because every deal is different. I've done roughly 85 I've been part of in my career now. Every one of them is different. And so having the humility to understand that I don't have all the answers, that I need to understand the context, that I need to really be inquisitive and curious, that I think is really helpful. So being humble, being flexible, and being able to build relationships are probably the most important skills. Those are the soft skills, but they're the hardest part of my work. As far as the technical skills go, I do believe financial literacy is really important. I believe a very keen understanding of employee relations, of some of your basic skills that you use in business partnering, as far as working with different centers of excellence, working with different stakeholders, and being able to understand some of the underlying issues that might be going on. Somebody who ultimately wants to make a career in HR M&A needs to be able to navigate total rewards really successfully, especially during the due diligence process, since that tends to be the numbers piece of it. Having some familiarity with organizational design, with change management, with employee relations. Those are probably the biggest skills that I rely on as I go through doing this work. One of the things that I like about M&A, Brandon, is that I feel like every couple of months, I get to use the full range of HR skills that I've developed over my career.
M&A is one of those unique places where you break everything at once. And, so you really have to have a systems thinking view on the business and your role. And so, that's the part of it I think that I find most stimulating and satisfying is looking at some of the tools that you've presented. You do a really nice job kind of summarizing what should be important, what should be material. What guidance would you give an HR professional that's new to this about what's relevant and what is something you'll fix later?
Yeah, that's well. So I think it depends on where you are in the deal. In the book I wrote, which really zeroes in on due diligence, during that early phase, what tends to be important are the deal financials, right? What's going to change the way that we look at how much running this business is going to cost, and again, what kind of synergies we can realize. But then you also have to start thinking about your integration timeline, and is something going to slow you down from integration? That can really be a material factor. That tends to be the two things that I look at from a materiality, time to integrate and cost. I also think that there is a underemphasis sometimes on reputational risk that can come out of an acquisition. And I do tend to consider that, right? If we screw this up, then, do we end up on the front page of the newspaper for not good reasons? So that tends to be the areas I look at for materiality. And then I think the thresholds are really contextual. So, I did one deal where we had to put a couple $1 million in escrow for FLSA misclassification, likely FLSA misclassification, much of it in the state of California, where it's treble damages and then potential penalties. So, that $2 million in the context of most deals would be material because it was a widespread problem. But I've also worked on deals where, the front desk person was misclassified and had worked a bunch of unpaid overtime. And, you might be looking at, I don't know, $100,000, which is not material. So same problem, different thresholds. And I think that's where context becomes really, really important. When you look at the overall purchase price for the acquisition, or you look at the timeline. So
I found as you're doing diligence and you're getting into the data rooms and reviewing all these files, it's helpful to have a dimension of what am I looking for as you go through and you make notes, and having maybe two categories. One of those things is, this is something I'm going to want to know to include in my integration planning, something I want to come back to. And then this is something that is really a decision criteria, right? We really need to evaluate this as a group before we make a decision. So I've heard you present on the concept of the triple bump. I know that you credit Mark Waltoni with some of that. Would you mind, talking a little bit about that?
That is all Mark, right? So Mark's one of the smartest guys I know. The idea behind the triple bump is essentially that when you have a change event that happens in an organization, you usually have a couple of talent hits that happen, and he calls each of those hits a bump. And the first bump happens when your A players leave. And I've seen that happen both with reorgs and with M&A. Your A players are just kind of, they know they're marketable and they're going to leave because they can, if things have changed in such a way that it's no longer the same value to them as individuals to stick around. So that's your first bump, is when your A players leave. Your second bump happens when all of a sudden you have an organization that's now run by a bunch of B players. And I've seen that happen in deals. Another friend of mine, Mark Prine, he says that if headhunters are sharks, an acquisition announcement is blood in the water, right? So the headhunters come in, they poach your A players, even those that maybe weren't thinking about leaving are getting phone calls. I've had situations happen where we've gone to do an announcement meeting and employees have come in already contacted by our competitors. So, they've got interviews lined up, and then we're welcoming them to the new company, right? It's amazing how quickly information spreads these days. But anyway, that's your first bump. Your second bump happens now that those folks have left. You've got a bunch of B players running your company. And most organizations will really struggle to have their B players actually making the critical decisions and running the organization. And then your third bump happens because you've had B players running the organization for so long, it really doesn't become a desirable place to work. So you now end up with an underperforming organization that cannot attract the A players to come into it. And I've seen that happen several times with acquisitions, even with standalones, where the requirements or the work environment change so much that they find it very difficult to attract talent. This is a really bad time to botch your acquisition and suddenly find yourself needing to fight for talent with the sheer number of openings we have in the sectors where M&A is most likely to happen.
Anything you've seen work really well to acknowledge that people are going to work a little harder, probably a lot harder, as you go through integration versus what they might do next door at the stable competitor? How do you
Yeah.
manage that?
I've not seen a company that handles that as elegantly as I'd like. I'll just be really candid. You're dealing with changing almost everything if you do a full integration. I've even seen it to the point where with some companies I've been with, people are getting new laptops, right? So it feels like you're onboarding as a brand new employee and you're onboarding in mass. When you're onboarding a group of employees en masse, like we do during most M&A events, they no longer have that structure in place in the same way. They get onboarded and everybody's confused. So one of the things that I'm a real big fan of is a very structured onboarding process for the new employees. You're getting your leaders involved to have conversations with the employees. And this is probably my biggest frustration with M&A deals is that I often see leaders disappear during integration. It is amazing the difference it makes to just have a leader stick around and hold office hours, or just show up and have a couple of all team meetings, even if they're virtual. And
I agree with you that the visibility, the availability of leaders is the easiest way for them to build confidence. Right? If they can say, you're going to hear from me every 2 weeks, and then you do, regardless of what the content is, you've just, proven credibility. Do you see any noticeable differences in deals based on where you're buying from?
the key difference when it comes to where you're buying is to understand the seller's motivation. So a private equity company is usually buying something, holding on to it for 4 or 5 years, growing it rapidly, and then selling it off, right? That's how a lot of those firms work. And that leads me to really try to understand what's motivating the employees. Is it that they're getting a big payout at the end of that 4-year period? Is it that they really like building and growing something? Is it that this just happens to be an industry that they like to be in? So trying to tease out those motivators can be really helpful for those key and critical employees. Private companies tend to operate on a longer time horizon, but they also tend to be a lot more secretive, right? There's a reason that they've never gone public. Usually somebody wants to hold on to a lot of control or not be bound to a bunch of disclosure rules so they can run the business in the way that they want. And similarly with public companies, there's a lot more information that's out there and available, but you tend to have far, far longer closing periods, getting the regulatory clearances, getting the votes done. So, with those, you have a whole different kind of change management mess, and you've got to try and stem the bleeding of talent during that regulatory approval period. So yeah, each of them do have their own challenges. I don't know that I prefer one to the other. It's just good to know what you might be walking into with those different sellers.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the information ecosystem, how you can use that as a part of your HR diligence, but also how you might use that if you're marketing your business?
Sure. So the information ecosystem is really all of those places that a buyer can go to find information about the seller's company. It starts off really by looking at public information and seeing what's out there with a very, very simple Google search. And it is stunning the amount of information that I can find about a company, its culture, and its founders, in many cases, just by looking at what shows up on Google, what shows up on that company's website, what shows up on social media like Glassdoor or even Yelp to talk about the customer experience. If they're doing regulatory filings, if they're doing some sort of press releases, most companies push a lot of information about themselves out into that ecosystem. So we want to make sure that they're in a place where the seller is in a place where they understand the information that's available about them and the things that'll turn up both good or bad. There's usually documents provided by the seller. There's usually some sort of teaser deck. There's usually a full data room of documents, and that makes up part of your ecosystem. Most organizations are going to have some sort of checklist that they'll send over that'll guide the documents in the Q&A. So that checklist being in good shape is really helpful. And I really encourage sellers. There are a ton of companies, including the Roundtable, that have a M&A checklists out there. Look at the checklist and see what folks are asking for with those document requests and start pulling them together early. Organizations also tend to underutilize their internal resources. My experience is that many buyers and sellers have some sort of pre-existing relationship. So the buyer may be a customer of the seller or a supplier to the seller. They may have sales reps that work with principals of that organization on a regular basis. If you're in the same industry, you may have people that have crossed over between the various companies. So having conversations with those people that are internal to the company about the target or about the potential buyer can be really helpful as well. And of course, you need to watch your non-disclosure requirements and make sure that those people are either under the tent or are speaking broadly enough that you don't violate your NDAs. But I do think that's a dramatically underused source of information for many companies during their diligence process. The information ecosystem also includes things like your final SPA, your final sales and purchase agreement for the organization. There's usually what they call disclosure schedules at the end of those, which are basically very long lists of things. And it's pretty phenomenal how those lists can really shape a view of the company, especially if those lists don't match what was provided earlier. That can be somewhat telling about an organization. So there's a lot of different pieces of information that are available as you work your way through a deal and with your team. One of my big recommendations is to have what I call a post-diligence huddle. So after each part of the deal diligence team has put together their report, pull the whole team together and ask two questions. The first question, who are the people that we're going to need to take the target company from point A to point B? And to reverse engineer that, a seller could easily ask, if I were in the buyer's shoes, what would that buyer need in terms of my team to go from point A to point B? And then start putting together dossiers on your people, right? Have their resume or their CV ready to go. Understand what their performance has been like and some of their key accomplishments. The other thing that I highly recommend happen during that post-diligence huddle is that the team ask, as we move this company from where it is now to where we want them to be, what are we going to break? That to me is probably the culmination of really understanding your ecosystem, are those two pieces. What are we going to break when we change the way that they do business? And who are the leaders that we need to have? Who are the people that we need to have to help that organization go from where they are to where we want them to be to add value?
What would you recommend to somebody who's interested in learning more about HR M&A or careers in HR M&A?
If you really are interested in the HR M&A world, and it's a really exciting, fun place to be. If you like to move at a fast pace, if you like to really see the underbelly of a business, there's no better place to do that than from an M&A role. The resources that I have, of course, the book that I wrote, the HR Practitioner's Guide to M&A Due Diligence, is really helpful for understanding the front end of the system. We do have the HR M&A Roundtable. It's not just the knowledge that we'll share, but the connections that you make, so that if you run into a messy situation, I get calls a couple times a week. Hey, Klint, run into a messy situation. What should I do?
No, I know, since meeting you and attending the HR M&A roundtables, I was really impressed with the quality of the content and the quality of the people. Klint, thank you so much for being generous with your time, for sharing your insights with us today, and also just, through the roundtable. I think it's a real blessing to people that are making their way into this space.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brandon. It was great to spend the time with you as well.